Good evening, everybody. I'm Ann Bryce with YOLO Audubon, and I'd like to welcome you to our virtual monthly meeting. And just a couple of ground rules. One is if you have a question now, if you'll put it in the chat as our speaker gets going, and Zane or Ken will pick it up and repeat it at the end of the session. Also, if you've seen any interesting birds, I think that's what I miss most about our in-person meetings is hearing what people have been seeing. So if you have something you want to tell us about, if you put it in the chat, we'll make sure to discuss it because it's getting to be a good time of year for birds. I just want to mention a couple of things. We've got lots of field trips set, and we have a couple of more in October. We have Sharon Kirkpatrick's leading a trip to Lake Solano and Puda Creek on the 30th, I think it is. And then Ed Whistler's doing his annual trip to the Davis Cemetery, which is always should be a fun trip. And it's a relatively short trip, it's just a morning trip. So check those out on our website. And I know they're posted on our Facebook page too for any details. And with everyone taking COVID safe protections, we're having a good time with our in-person field trips. And also I just wanted a little advance notice to tell you that we're starting to think about the Christmas bird count. Bart Wickel has taken over for long-term compiler Steve Hampton and looks to be doing a great job. He's got all of his area leaders signed up, and he will be posting all the information on the website. So please check there, and if you see a trip that you're interested in the area, there's a neat map that shows you all the areas, and it's interactive this year, and then you can get in touch with the area leader and get signed up. So that won't be until, I'm getting way ahead of myself, that won't be until December 19th. Is that right, Ken? And then the 8th, I think it is, the meeting will be the regular fun ID meeting via Zoom that the guys are working on. Okay, I'm going to turn it over.
Those dates are correct, Ann.
Okay, good. And having said that, I'm turning it over to you to introduce our speaker.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. I think we have an exciting presentation tonight because I'm kind of partial to California scrub jays. And so what we're going to hear about tonight is testing the social intelligence hypothesis in wild jays. We're welcoming, I'm really pleased to welcome back Dr. Kelsey McCune. And so what we're going to hear about is why do some species evolved complex cognitive behaviors while others do not? And you know, if you've observed any wildlife, you kind of see the loners, you see the animals that group together in colonies, herds. I don't know about herds, but different colonies type of things, and they interact. And so we're going to hear again from Dr. Kelsey McCune, and I'm kind of excited about that. Now, Kelsey McCune, she completed her PhD in animal behavior from the University of Washington in 2018. And her dissertation compared asocial scrub jays and social Mexican jays. I think that might be Mexican jays, you know, on social behavior, learning and personality traits. And so hopefully we'll take away some information tonight to help us in our viewing of these animals. She's working on her postdoctoral scholar. She's a postdoctoral scholar at UC Santa Barbara, and she's part of the Grackle research program. You may recall she spoke about grackles last year. And so with that, I would like to welcome once again Dr. Kelsey McCune, you're on.
Thank you, Ken. That was a very thorough introduction. I feel like we can just skip to the results now. Okay, I'll go ahead and share my screen. Okay, so as Ken mentioned, you guys probably remember me from last year when I presented on the great-tailed grackles. That's the current research that I'm doing right now as a postdoctoral fellow, and so that's the reason I'm in California. But today I want to talk to you about the research that I did during my PhD program in animal behavior at the University of Washington. And as you heard, my dissertation was called Cognition Gone Wild, Testing the Social Intelligence Hypothesis in Wild Birds. So I was interested in why these seemingly intelligent behaviors seem to evolve in some species, but not others. But what do I actually mean when I say intelligence? Or sometimes I'll call it complex cognitive behaviors or traits. And these are some examples are listed here on the right, and these are traits that humans excel at, but are actually relatively uncommon in the animal kingdom. And tonight I'm going to focus on these two traits: problem-solving ability and social learning ability. So because it is energetically expensive to maintain a brain capable of these kinds of complex cognitive abilities, there must be some factor in the species environment that requires it to evolve these more intelligent behaviors. So for example, a diverse array of species can socially learn. I've put pictures of some of them here. They are vertebrates and invertebrates. They live in the sea, on land, and in the air. So what environmental factor do they share in common that likely led to the evolution of this cognitive ability? So here's a video of a social learning in action that demonstrates one factor favoring the evolution of social learning. So this is a baby chimpanzee, and it's her. Her mom is using a stone tool to open a nut. And they're sitting very close together, and the baby's paying close attention to each part of the behavior of using the stone tool to get the edible part from this nut. So this is something that I want you guys to remember as we continue to go through the talk, and we'll circle back to it in a little while. So the predominant hypothesis to explain this, how some species have evolved these complex cognitive behaviors, is called the social intelligence hypothesis. And this was conceptualized by Alison Jolly in 1966 while she was studying lemurs in Madagascar. And she said social life preceded and determined the nature of primate intelligence. So what she means here is that when you evolve in a group of animals where there are social interactions that could result in you potentially becoming injured or dying, or at least not being able to reproduce, then you might need to evolve certain cognitive abilities to navigate these social interactions to your benefit. And these types of complex interactions can include dominance hierarchies, long-term repeated interactions with the same individuals, delayed maturation of offspring. So you have the offspring that delay dispersing to other groups, and they need a really long time to learn the skills necessary for life. So these are the kinds of things that we think about might result in the need to evolve more complex cognitive abilities. So if you're a researcher and you're wanting to test whether the social intelligence hypothesis is true for your species, you need to measure two things. The first is social behavior, and so I'll be using an icon like this to represent social behavior throughout the talk. And the other is some aspect of intelligence or some cognitive ability. And again, look for this icon throughout the talk to know that we're talking about cognitive traits. And so since 1966, many researchers have indeed been looking within their study taxa to find evidence for the social intelligence hypothesis. And here we have a study from Dunbar in 1998, where he looked at a bunch of different primate species, and he compared the average group size, or this is their social behavior on the y-axis, to their average brain size here on the x-axis. And he found this nice correlation where individuals or species that have larger average group sizes also tend to have larger brains. So kind of implying that social behavior selected for more complex cognitive abilities. However, this is not consistent. There has not been consistent evidence for the social intelligence hypothesis across taxa. And in particular, in birds, the study by Emery and colleagues in 2007 found that the most social birds, over here on this end of the graph, the very gregarious species where they exist in groups that are larger than 200 individuals, actually had smaller than expected brain sizes, whereas the birds that exist in small groups of 5 to 30 individuals had the largest brain sizes. So does social behavior not lead to the evolution of complex cognitive abilities, to intelligence, or have we just been measuring it poorly? As you might guess, today I'm here to talk to you about how we might have been measuring it poorly and how we can do better, and how I've tried to do better during my PhD dissertation. So previous research on the social intelligence hypothesis has had several limitations. The first is that most researchers use indirect measures of social behavior. So they're not actually measuring behavioral interactions between individuals, they just measure things like group size. So this is a measure of the quantity of social relationships that you can have. Here, this example is wildebeest, where they can exist in groups in the like thousands. And so one individual wildebeest can have a very large potential of social relationships, but they will likely never have repeated social interactions with one individual. There might not be a dominance hierarchy, so you might not see these more complicated social relationships that we think might be necessary to evolve cognitive traits. In contrast, it might be more important to have high quality social relationships. These might be the kinds of situations where you would expect intelligence to evolve. And so we have ravens as an example here. So they form lifelong pair bonds, and the male and the female have to coordinate their behavior in space and time to raise babies and defend the territory. They remember each other's past behavior so they can predict how they should act in the future towards their mate. So these high quality social relationships might need more complex cognitive abilities, but all past research assumes that high quantity of social relationships is equivalent to high quality social relationships. Secondly, another limitation is that most previous research uses indirect measures of intelligence. So as we saw in the previous figures, to measure intelligence across taxa, most researchers have used brain size. And this is problematic because the size and shape of an animal's brain is very dependent on species-specific life history characteristics. So if we think about birds, their whole body and each of its components is constrained by the need to fly. They have to be light enough so that they can hold themselves in the air. And in fact, research by Olkowitz and colleagues in 2016 found that the brains of birds were smaller than brains of monkeys, but they contained way more neurons. So basically the neurons, which are the brain cells that are really important for complex cognitive behavior, for cognition at all, they were packed a lot more densely into the brains of birds than they are into monkeys. And so it doesn't seem like measuring just gross brain size is a good idea for measuring intelligence. You can't translate that across taxa. And so if you don't want to sacrifice your subjects so that you can look at their brain and count their neurons, a better alternative for measuring intelligence is to conduct cognitive assessments. And so that brings me to the third limitation of previous research, where much of the research that actually does conduct cognitive assessments on animals occurs in captivity. So when you have animals in captivity, they're out of their natural environment. And so, of course, what you're seeing is they aren't experiencing the natural social world. Any of their natural foraging behavior is limited. And so like this chimpanzee in this sort of barren testing room, the performance of this chimpanzee is not going to be equivalent to that of chimpanzees in the wild because they are experiencing a completely different situation. Also, a lot of animals in captivity are born in captivity or they live their entire life in captivity. So they have a much different perspective, much more experience interacting with human experiments or human-made objects to get food. And that really changes the way that they interact with tasks. And this makes it not generalizable to the species as a whole. So it's hard to understand the evolution of cognition in this species. Furthermore, a lot of the methods that researchers use to measure cognition on animals in captivity can be a little obscure and not related to their natural environment in any way. So this research by Povinelli and Vonk was using buckets on the heads of researchers to try to understand whether this chimpanzee has what's called a theory of mind. This is a cognitive ability where you can understand the knowledge state of another individual. And as you might imagine, chimpanzees don't evolve with buckets in their natural environment or anything that really looks like a bucket. So before you can even measure the performance of this chimpanzee, there has to be extensive training to teach the chimpanzee what a bucket is, what happens when you have a bucket on your head. And because of that extensive training and these ecologically not relevant methods and materials, then these assessments, the performance on these assessments is also hard to generalize to the species as a whole. So as all young PhD students do, I very idealistically wanted to change the field and address all of these limitations of previous research and conduct a better test of the social intelligence hypothesis. And I wanted to do so by directly measuring both quantity and quality of social behavior, and also by comparing the performance of wild and captive subjects on a problem-solving task. And lastly, I wanted to do a very direct test of the social intelligence hypothesis by comparing the social learning ability of a social and an asocial species to see whether the social species actually was better at this cognitive trait. So to do so, I studied the California scrub jay and the Mexican jay. And these two species are in the same genus, so they're very closely related. They look very similar and they have very similar environmental traits and life history characteristics. However, they're extremely different in their social system. So as many of you probably know, the California scrub jay is a singular breeder. So a male and a female will pair up. They'll defend a territory against all other jays. They raise babies, but once those babies are independent, they aggressively kick them off of their territory. In contrast, the Mexican jay is considered a communal cooperative breeder. So they exist in groups or flocks of 5 to 25 individuals, all on the same territory. During the breeding season, a couple of the adults will pair up, so you can have as many as 3 nests going at a time on a territory. Once the eggs in those nests hatch, all of the jays in the group help to feed and protect those offspring, regardless of whether they're related to it. And then once those babies become independent, most of them will stay in their group for 2 years and some of them for their entire life. So maybe you can see that this social environment is much more similar to a chimpanzee's, where there are many long-term and repeated social interactions that happen between the jays and these stable groups. The young have a very long amount of time to learn the necessary skills for foraging and other behaviors from knowledgeable individuals in their group. And there is a dominance hierarchy. So if you act wrong to the wrong jay, it's possible you could get beat up or injured, and this is bad for you. And I was very lucky to be able to study these two species in 2 equally beautiful study sites. So I studied the California scrub jay in Willamette Mission State Park in Oregon. And I studied the Mexican jay in the Southwestern Research Station in Arizona, which, if you haven't been there, is a magnificent place to go see birds. For my questions, I needed to be able to identify individuals in the wild. So I spent a lot of time trapping jays with these walk-in traps baited with peanuts. And then when I caught them, I'd give them these color bracelets in different combinations so I can tell them apart. And then I released them again back to their territory. So in all, I had 49 California scrub jays and 73 Mexican jays in 7 groups as part of my sample. So let's jump right in and talk about my first dissertation chapter, where I wanted to directly measure both quantity and quality of social behavior. And this was to rehash, this was to test the assumption of previous researchers that individuals that exist in large groups are also experiencing the high quality of social interactions that likely select for more complex cognitive abilities. So to measure social behavior, I did focal follows by tracking down all of the color banded jays after I'd released them in the wild. And then I followed them around for 10 minutes across 6 different occasions. And while I was following them, I wrote down, I noted all of the other color banded jays that they were in proximity to. And so I measured relationship quality as the distance that the 2 individuals were apart, plus the duration that they spent at that distance. So really high quality relationship is one in which individuals spend a lot of time in close proximity. And relationship quantity was just a count of the number of other different individuals that that focal bird was seen with over the 6 different focal follows. So we're going to jump right into the results. So as a reminder, I measured relationship quantity as the number of other jays that the focal bird was seen with. And as expected, the asocial species, the California scrub jay, had significantly fewer social relationships with other jays compared to the Mexican jay. And so this is not surprising. This is really what we would expect just based on their social system. And now we're going to look at my results for relationship quality. And if the assumptions of past researchers are correct in that relationship quantity can map on to these high quality relationships, then the plot for this figure here on the right should look exactly the same as the figure on the left. But what I actually found is that the asocial species, the California scrub jay, had a significantly higher amount of relationship quality of the index of relationship quality than the Mexican jays. And this is not what we would predict based on the assumptions of previous researchers. But what we're seeing is a trade-off between relationship quantity and relationship quality. And so this kind of points out that if you're interested in measuring social behavior to see if it might influence the evolution of cognition in your species, it's important to measure both quantity and quality of social relationships, because different cognitive abilities might select for, different types of social behavior, the quantity or the quality might select for different cognitive abilities, but we don't know that yet because not enough people have measured both. So for my second chapter, I wanted to compare the problem-solving performance of jays in captivity to jays in the wild to test the assumption from previous research that performance of captive subjects on cognitive assessments is equivalent to what you would see in their wild conspecifics, or wild individuals of the same species. And additionally, I wanted to use an ecologically relevant task. So I created these puzzle boxes out of logs, and each one has compartments covered by 4 doors that open in different ways. And so the behaviors that the jays will need to use to get to the peanuts beneath the doors are similar to what we see in the wild when they're foraging or trying to recover a cache. And in this way, it's a more ecologically relevant task. I also want to point out that I only had access to cages to keep animals in captivity at the Southwestern Research Station. And so this portion of my research only pertains to the Mexican jay. So I put the puzzle box out for the jays, and it looked just like this, with the doors closed and filled with peanuts. And I measured how much time the individuals spent within 2 meters of the puzzle box and how many times it was able to open a door to get a peanut. And so I judged that the jay had learned how to solve a door. He'd proved that he learned it, that he solved that problem after he opened the door 3 times. And so the maximum number of solves that a jay could have is 12. And then I had 10 jays in captivity and 7 jays in the wild that participated in this test. So here's what it looks like with a jay in the aviaries. So these are the captive jays interacting with the puzzle box. The aviaries had these really nice, like, one-way windows so that I could observe the jay, but they couldn't see me. And the reward for the jays in captivity was actually live worms, because they would cache the peanuts all throughout the aviary, and then they weren't that motivated to participate for peanuts because they could just go recover a cache whenever they wanted. But they really liked the juicy worms. Okay, and this is what the problem-solving test looked like on a jay in the wild. So now Mexican jays are social, but I didn't want any jay to be able to solve the puzzle box because it had previously watched another jay do it. That's social learning, and that's what I wanted to test later. So for this part of the experiment, I put the puzzle box out on the territory of one of the groups, and the first jay that came down to interact with the puzzle box was my subject. And any other jay that approached the puzzle box during the trials, I shooed away. So I really just want an individual's learning performance. Okay, so for the results, I'm going to show you them on this graph, where on the y-axis we have a measure of jay performance, and on the x-axis we have the amount of time that it took. So here for the captive jays, we have this gray line, and you can see that they slowly and steadily open some of the doors. So here the line kind of tops out at about 50% of the jays were able to solve one of the doors on the puzzle box. In contrast, the wild jays did way better. So they much more quickly solved many more doors. So you can see they spent less time getting to this 0.6 mark, or 60% of the jays got there quickly. And then overall, about 70% of the jays solved the puzzle box. So that was a statistically significant difference between the jays in captivity and the jays in the wild. So even though the jays in captivity were acting totally normal to me, to my perspective, I couldn't tell any difference between the way that the jays in captivity interacted with the puzzle box compared to the jays in the wild. There was something about captivity that inhibited their performance on this puzzle box task. And so this kind of shows that we should not be measuring cognitive abilities of animals in captivity for a myriad of reasons. And we should really try to shift towards measuring cognitive abilities of the individuals in the wild. I also want to note that my experiment involved temporary captivity. So the jays were only in the aviary for about 3 weeks, and they were all adults already when I brought them in. And this is different, can lead to differences in performance compared to individuals that spend their entire life in captivity or were born in captivity. So a recent paper by Sarah Benson Amram found that in spotted hyenas, the hyenas that were in captivity in zoos, so they had been in captivity their entire lives, the problem-solving ability was much greater than that seen in hyenas in the wild. So for either case, temporary captivity or lifetime captivity, you're still seeing results that are not the same as what you would see in the wild. And this means that it's really difficult to generalize performance of those in captivity to the species as a whole, and it leaves us unable to say what factors contribute to the evolution of intelligence. Okay, so we have directly measured both quantity and quality of social behavior, and we have compared problem-solving ability in wild and captive individuals. So now it's time to talk about my direct test of the social intelligence hypothesis by comparing social learning performance of the California scrub jay and the Mexican jay. So I chose to measure social learning as the most relevant cognitive ability for species that live in social groups like the Mexican jays do. And I actually used the same puzzle box as for the problem solving experiment, except I added these locks to the doors. So we have 2 stick locks and 1 hook and eye lock. And this makes it so that it's almost impossible for any jay to figure out how to open the door on its own. And so hopefully what the goal is here is to measure whether the jays are observing a knowledgeable demonstrator interact with the puzzle box and the lock, and whether they're changing their behavior. And so that's the definition of social learning: a change in behavior of a naive individual after observing a knowledgeable conspecific. So how did I get knowledgeable conspecifics in these groups of jays? I trained them. So I chose a few jays from each species as demonstrators to open the locks on the puzzle boxes for this social learning task. For the California scrub jays, because they're asocial, I could train jays in isolation without other jays being able to see and cheat and kind of learn about the task before I was ready to test them. So I put the puzzle box in the very center of their territory, and then none of the neighbors could come close enough because the territorial jay will chase them off aggressively. And as you remember, the Mexican jays, I had 10 in captivity already. So after they were done with their problem solving test, I trained them on how to open one of the locks on the puzzle box. And here is a video showing what that looks like. And so by training them in captivity in the same ways with the California scrub jays, I was able to have only a select few of the Mexican jays that knew how to open the lock on the puzzle box. And then once they were opening the lock consistently and efficiently, I was able to release them back to their group. And this made me very happy because I felt bad about keeping them in captivity. And now I got to see if my whole experiment was going to work. Okay, so to do the trials, we need to have naive individuals with the opportunity to observe the demonstrators, the knowledgeable conspecifics, interacting with the task. And then I need to be able to measure the change in behavior of the naive birds after they've seen the lock being opened. For California scrub jays, they're asocial. So to create a situation where individuals can observe each other across territories, I put the puzzle boxes out in open and grassy picnic areas in my state park. And these picnic areas were surrounded by multiple territories of jays. And so each jay would come into the picnic area for food, and none of them defended it as part of their own territory. So one of the territories of jays were trained as the demonstrators. And so they could come in and interact with the puzzle box and open the lock. And then the naive birds would be able to observe, and I could measure how did the naive birds change their behavior in response. For the Mexican jays, since they already live in a social group, all I had to do was put the puzzle boxes out on the territory of the social group. Again, I had 1 or 2 of the Mexican jays in the group had been in captivity and were trained how to open the lock. I then also compared the performance of these groups that had demonstrators to the performance of control groups where there were no trained jays that knew how to open the locks on the puzzle box. And so we would find support for the social intelligence hypothesis if Mexican jays with demonstrators, Mexican jays in groups with demonstrators, perform better on the social learning task than the Mexican jays in groups without demonstrators. And because we expect that California scrub jays are asocial, and therefore they shouldn't possess this social learning ability, we would expect that the groups that have demonstrators and the control groups without would perform the same. And Comparing across species, we would expect that the naive Mexican jays would contact the puzzle box more after observing demonstrators than the naive California scrub jays. Or in other words, the California scrub jays, the asocial species, will perform worse at the social learning task than the social Mexican jays. So I put the puzzle boxes out on the territories, and I did about 16 trials per species per group. And I had a camera focused on each of the 2 puzzle boxes. So that's what you're looking at here. And this way I had video recordings where I then had many tireless undergrads help me code all of the interactions that occurred at each puzzle box and identify the color band combinations of each J that showed up within the screen of the video. I was present for all of the trials, and I also sought out and identified any color banded birds that were present in the area, potentially observing the interactions at the puzzle box, but that you couldn't see in the frame of the video. Okay, so I'm going to show you a clip of an interaction that occurred during one of the social learning trials. We'll kind of give you an idea of why we might expect that a naive individual could change its behavior after observing the demonstrator interact with the puzzle box and open the lock. So this is a naive J. Here's the demonstrator and another naive J. So the naive Jays are able to stand in very close proximity to the demonstrator and are able to see every portion of the demonstrator's behavior with the lock and how it was able to open it. And it was even able to benefit by stealing the peanut. So this is why we might expect that some species might be able to learn from the behavior of others to acquire new foraging skills, like opening the lock on this puzzle box. But is that what actually happens? Okay, so I'm going to show you the results on the same kind of graphs as before, where the y-axis is a measure of performance at the social learning task. The x-axis is a measure of time, trial time. And then you're going to see the groups that have demonstrators, the experimental groups, in black lines, and the control groups where there were no demonstrators are going to show up in gray lines. So did the Mexican Jays in groups with demonstrators perform better? Yes, very much so. So you can see here that the black line goes up more quickly, showing that the Jays in the groups of demonstrators were able to solve more doors on the puzzle box and interact with it more in general, much more quickly compared to the Jays in groups without demonstrators. What about the California scrub Jays? So if you remember, we predicted that if the social intelligence hypothesis is playing a role in the evolution of cognition in this system, that there would be no difference between Jays in groups with demonstrators and Jays in groups without demonstrators. And that is what we found. So the initial results here from the social learning experiment do support the social intelligence hypothesis. But when I looked closer at it, I found that California scrub jays and Mexican jay adults are actually not different in their performance at the social learning task. And this is not what we would expect. And that's because I had a variable in the models for age, and age was important for the Mexican jays. So here we have Mexican jays in, species in the columns, and age is in the rows. So if we look down here at this bottom right figure, these are the Mexican jay juveniles, and the juveniles that were in groups with demonstrators did way better at the task than juveniles in groups without demonstrators. And once we split it out by age, we see that the adult Mexican jays don't really differ on performance at the social learning task, depending on whether they have a demonstrator or not. Unfortunately, I didn't really have a large enough sample size of juvenile California scrub jays to look at this statistically. And so I can't really say whether juvenile California scrub jays would demonstrate the same effect where they would benefit more from social learning. And this is a good direction for future research. So I found that social species did seem to use the social information and the asocial species did not. And I also found that social information does seem to be the most important for the juveniles from the social species, the Mexican jays. So I want you to think back about that video of the chimpanzee learning from her mother how to use a tool, and think about the video we saw of the Mexican jays during the social learning trials. And I'm going to show you two videos to help explain why social learning might be favored in some species and not others. So here on the right is the Mexican jay video, and this is the most aggressive interaction I ever saw at the puzzle box for the Mexican jays. Oh, just that, just a little tiny little almost peck. And this is a juvenile here. You can tell because it has white on its beak. So it's just on a loop. Just going to watch it one more time. Okay. And in contrast, this is the video of the California scrub jays. So first we'll see a juvenile here thinking about interacting with the puzzle box. And then here comes an adult just basically trying to kill it. So if you think about it, for the Mexican jay juveniles, there's no risk to being able to be close to a knowledgeable adult. And so they're much more likely to be benefited by having a cognitive ability like social learning. They are able to be close and watch closely all of the behaviors of the adult to learn this new foraging skill. Whereas it doesn't make a whole lot of sense for the California scrub jay to evolve this ability when they can't even really be close enough to see in detail what the other individual is doing without being attacked. So I think the main takeaway points that are important for my dissertation are that people should really be measuring quantity and quality of social relationships together, because they might both be important in the evolution of cognition, but so far nobody really looks at both. And that, again, it's very important to measure cognition in the natural, social, and physical environment, because this is where behaviors and cognition evolve to begin with. So we can't understand the extent of these abilities unless we're measuring them in the same context. And lastly, evolution in social groups does affect some aspects of intelligence and not others, but there is so much more to learn here and so many other cognitive abilities to test. So I'm done with the J portion of what I wanted to tell you guys about. And I want to thank all of the people that helped me with my dissertation research. I had many wonderful field assistants. And because I presented here last year on grackles, I thought I might throw in just like a few slides about grackles, because actually we are using the same puzzle boxes to measure problem solving in grackles. And we are also training them to open some of the locks for a social learning test that we haven't done yet. So I wanted to give you guys some highlights. Okay, so here is a plot showing the performance of all of the individuals that I've so far tested with problem solving on the puzzle box. And we have here California scrub jays, which I didn't tell you about or show you, but I also did measure it with them in the same way as with the wild Mexican jays, just on their territory in the wild. And they actually didn't do that well on it. So you can see all the red dots are kind of clustered here in the bottom left corner. And that's because they didn't solve very many doors and they didn't spend that much time around the task. As we saw from my dissertation work, the wild Mexican jays in blue did much better than the captive Mexican jays in green. So we have up here, most of the wild Mexican jays solved all the doors, while only a very few of the captive ones did. And for the grackles here in purple, what we're seeing is that they are pretty good at solving all of the doors on the puzzle box, but they take a much longer time to do it. We have a lot more data still to collect and to code from videos on the great-tailed grackles. So this is just a snapshot. And so I want to show you what it looks like for a grackle to open a lock on a puzzle box. And I thought if you guys are interested, we could take a little poll where you can vote on who you think did it better. Do you like the way that the grackle opens the lock on the puzzle box, or do you like the way that the jay does it? So I'll show you 2 videos and we'll watch the grackle first. And this grackle's name was Burrito because he was so big and kind of chubby, just like a burrito. Okay, so let's just watch that one more time. So he is in the aviary because this is during training, hence why we have the concrete floor here. And the idea is that when we release him and put the puzzle box out in the wild, he will perform and open the puzzle box just like he did here for other naive grackles to observe. No, okay. So here is a Mexican jay demonstrator opening the same lock on the puzzle box in the wild. The log is oriented a little differently. So it's going to come into this lock on the left of the log. All right, there we go. So you can put your vote in the chat. I personally like the casual saunter and the carefree slap of the leg that the grackle does to open the lock, but jays are my favorite birds ever, so I have to give them some credit too. And in fact, that brings me to my very last slide for my talk here. This is probably one of my favorite things that I saw during my dissertation research. So I trained a few jays to open just these 2 locks. So the demonstrators learned either how to open the top one or the side one. I didn't train any of them how to open this lock. And it's a hook and eye lock, so it's like a relatively more complicated lock. And this juvenile Mexican jay just came over one time and just figured it out on his own. So he just like seemingly easily just was able to figure out how to open the lock and get the peanut. And no other jays ever were able to figure out how to open this lock. He was the only one. So I love it. And I just wanted to share that with you guys. Okay, so now I am happy to take any and all questions that people might have. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing.
Excuse me, Kelsey, I forget the question that people are responding to about the grackle and the jays.
Mm-hmm. Who did it better? Let me see what the
Okay,
chat
who did
says.
it better?
Oh, people love the grackle. I
Yes.
also love the grackle.
It was just so cool.
Yeah, he's so
Yeah.
casual about it. And
Yeah,
actually, we trained him and he originally learned how to open the lock with his beak. And then one day he was just like, no, I'm tired of this beak stuff. I'm just going to slap it with my foot.
yeah. So let's see, we have one question. And it was the aggressive interaction in scrub jays between a parent and a child?
I don't know. That's a great question. And I wish that I had been able to figure that out, but we weren't able to color ban the juveniles until they had dispersed from the territory. So we couldn't catch any of them just because it was too difficult and we didn't put enough effort in to catch the babies while they were still in their territory. So we couldn't tell whose parent was who. I actually do have some blood samples still from scrub jays that I've never gotten analyzed for genetic relatedness. That was my goal at the time, but here we are. That was, that was like 2016. So,
okay.
So I say it's a really good thing for future research to address.
Yes. Yeah. Another question, I think is pretty good. Do you think the social standing of the demonstrator matters and how quickly others learn?
Yes, it definitely can. That's a good question. So there's actually, it's mixed. Some people have found that in birds, they learn better from more dominant individuals. And other people have found that the more subordinate individuals are the ones that are more likely to be able to interact with these complicated tasks. And then the dominant ones will come and try to steal the food. So I at first I wasn't sure whether to choose subordinate or dominant, and I ended up choosing dominant individuals. So before I caught Jays to bring into captivity, I did a dominance assessment where I just look at how many times they're they're mean to each other at a small food source. So who was the one that had the most displacements or aggressive interactions towards the other individuals? And I tried to catch those to be the demonstrators.
Okay, and then someone was wondering if you would, what are the implications of applying this to woodhouse jays?
Yeah, fun fact. When I first started my PhD, they were all Western scrub jays.
Yeah.
So halfway through, I had to change everything to be California scrub jay instead of Western scrub jay. I think that, so woodhouse's scrub jays are supposed to be, I think, if I remember right, even less social than California scrub jays. So they might be even more aggressive towards other individuals, like their neighbors. And I know that they are supposed to be more secretive and more shy. So they would probably actually be like harder to work with in the wild, because they might be less likely to participate in your experimental task.
Okay. And the last question so far is, was food similarly available in the two natural environments?
Yes, it was. And I do have some data on this that I haven't really done anything with, but they're both in these scrubby oak and pine habitats. And so in the state park, there were a bunch of oak trees, but it was also used to be a hazelnut plantation. So there was just like hazelnuts galore. And I have data on their foraging behavior from the focal follows, and how much they collected food and how much they cached and recached. And it was similar across the jays species, but I haven't really done anything with, like, published those data anywhere.
Okay. The next question is curiosity about how the social group responded to the removal of the jays into captivity and then to their release. They probably had a party on their release, you know. They're rehabilitated and they're ready to rejoin society.
Yeah.
But anyway, do you get any sort of signals, insights, or signs to the return of those jays? Or were they missed?
Ina, such good questions. So this is something I really wanted to do more with, but I didn't have enough data because I only took into captivity 10 jays. So that was 2 jays from each of like 5 groups. And I had focal follow behavior on them before and after, for jays in the group before I removed the demonstrators, and then jays in the group after. And I saw that there was some disruption in their social behavior. So the way that I analyze social behavior is called social network analysis. It's kind of confusing, but the network was kind of disrupted where it was less connected. So the jays weren't interacting as much. And this is kind of anecdotal, but some of the demonstrator jays that I let back into their groups were, 2 of them disappeared. So it's possible they got bullied out of their group after they'd been gone for a while. But like I said, that's anecdotal. I wasn't able to really confirm what was going on because I didn't see aggressive interactions towards those jays. They just happened to disappear. So yes, it's very likely that social groups are affected when individuals are removed and returned. And they have done some research to experimentally show that in some primate groups. That's pretty interesting.
Wow. Yeah, it makes you wonder if when they're gone, there's this cog missing, or puzzle piece missing. And then when it comes back, they've adjusted. Then when it comes back, it's like, oh, okay, we don't have a place for you. Or I wonder if the bands was like, oh, something's different here. I don't know.
Yeah, especially because I was taking the dominant jays.
Yeah.
So that there's definitely possibility for that to have a cascading effect, but
Yeah.
and it seemed like it was, but I wasn't able to have a large enough sample size to like
Yeah.
explicitly test it.
Yeah. It's almost like a whole nother study
Yeah.
on social animals. Yeah.
Yes, definitely.
Okay. Here's a long one. Okay. Sort of two questions. Was there ever more than one scrub jay in an enclosure at a time, or were there always individuals?
Yeah, there were always two. So this was part of my animal care and use permit because they're social species.
Mm.
It was better to keep them not isolated, basically. So I took 2 individuals per group, and they were together in an aviary. And the aviaries were very large.
Very well.
They were like 12 feet by 8 feet by 8 feet, I think. So there was a lot of space for them to fly around, and they were never aggressive towards each other within the aviary. So the aviaries were on the campus of the research station, which was the territory of one of the groups of jays. And so when jays from other groups were in the aviaries, the resident station jays would come and harass them through the roof, through the like cage walls. But yes, to the question, they were always in a pair. And I thought that was appropriate because the California scrub jays, I also trained as a pair. So then it was comparable across species too.
And the second part of that one is if the birds behave differently in the enclosed artificial environment, I guess, versus out in the wild.
Yeah, it's hard to say. So I gave them habituation time in the aviaries until they were acting comfortably towards the puzzle box and towards their food dishes. When they first get into the aviaries, they fly around like mad trying to find a way out. And so you definitely want to wait for that to stop. After that, when they're acting comfortably with their food and sitting on the perches, it's hard to say if it's different than in the wild, but it's gotta be, there's not as much stuff in there. I put a lot of branches in there so they would have some foliage to hide in and to forage on, but it's nothing like being in the wild. So yeah, I think it still is different, but it wasn't different towards the puzzle box in a way that made me feel like their performance should be different.
Okay. And we have another that says, how territorial are Mexican jays and how can, the territorial behavior between Mexican jays groups, I guess, that are adjoining?
Yeah. So they were neighbors. The groups that I studied were neighbors, and they were very aggressive towards each other. So if I ever saw any fights, it was between jays from different groups, and you would see them fighting in a similar way to the California scrub jays in the adult California scrub jay in that video towards the juvenile, where they just come like screaming in to like dive bomb and, try to grab someone.
Now, anecdotally, did you notice if these interactions were more trespassing, or did you notice anything of territorial expansion?
A little of both. So along the borders, if both the groups were there, they would fight because I think essentially they were concerned that the other group was trying to expand. But so I don't know how many people know, but this population of Mexican jays has been studied since the 60s. So Jerem Brown was the original researcher to come in and start color banding these flocks of jays. And so since then, people have been interacting with them, feeding them, getting them to come in to food so that they can be trapped. And a lot of times, so they're trained to come to the whistle. You like whistle and they'll come in because they know that means food. I trained the California scrub jays to do that too. It made it much more easy to get them to participate in the task quickly. So sometimes when you whistle for your target group of jays, jays from the neighboring group will come over and try to get the food because they've equally learned. So it's a matter of like whistling only loud enough for the group that's your territory you're on, it will come in.
Okay. Okay. Do you think the stress of captivity significantly affects the jay's performance on cognitive tasks?
Yeah, so I measured different aspects of their performance other than just solving. So you saw time within 2 meters, but I also measured the number of attempts, like how many times did they peck at the door trying to get it open before they actually succeeded. And I have to remember back to my own paper. If I remember right, they had a similar number of attempts and solves, but the captive jays spent less time within 2 meters. So from the data that I collected, it looked like the captive jays were spending more time trying to simultaneously be vigilant to predators and learn the task. And so with the divided attention, it took them longer, but they felt at risk because they're out of their control here in this cage. Also, previous research with chickadees found that chickadees that were kept in captivity for even just like 2 weeks, they lose brain volume. So they lose neurons in their brain in the hippocampus, which is like the area for like spatial memory, for remembering where they can find food. So they compared basically birds that were in the wild, and then they looked at their brains, and then over the same time period, birds were in captivity, and they looked at their brains, and they found the ones in captivity lost brain volume. So they didn't really have an idea of why that might happen, but it's just being in captivity, even if it's completely normal and similar to your natural environment, affects their brains.
Do you know if they tracked if those birds, once released, regain volume? Or I don't know if that stuff can.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I don't remember that study. That's a good question.
Yeah. So you have a group of chickadees out there on social assistance then.
I
don't know where to get food. Okay, here's one. I'm going to read it so I don't mess up what the person's trying to say. Awesome talk, by the way, they said. It's interesting that wild Mexican jays were faster, better at solving the food puzzle than the captive Mexican jays. Do you think a fear of predators or a need to get a food source quickly before a conspecific tries to get the food could affect the speed at which the wild versus captive birds solve the puzzles?
Yes, I do think that's possible because I had the 2 jays in captivity in the aviaries. There might have been heightened competition. And so I don't know if they were also like trying to pay attention to the other one and compete, and the competition made them slower, or if it was just the heightened vigilance. Certainly in the wild, as you saw from that one video, if you don't act fast to grab your pet, then somebody else will.
Yeah, thanks for opening that.
Yeah. That's something that you could test by looking at, is there a difference in performance speed based on the number of birds that you have in captivity? So that's a good question for future research.
Okay, we've come to the end. Any other questions, folks? Time is short, so get them in there real quick. But I do want to, I hope all of you join me in thanking Kelsey and visiting us tonight, and to me, providing a very interesting talk on the jays. And I kind of like watching behavior of birds, seeing what they do and how they do it and why they do it. I never come to any, I'm not going to write a paper. I just go, wow, that was interesting. And maybe look for it next time. But anyway, I really appreciate you taking the time and the effort to put together this talk and present it to us. And I thank you very much for that. Folks are saying wonderful talk. Thank you, and I agree with them. It's fascinating. It's just absolutely fascinating what you're doing, and on a bird that we all see,
Yeah.
and in our backyards. And it's something that I will, well, since I only have scrub jays, I don't have a comparison, but I have noticed things with them, and it's just interesting critters. So with that, thank you. I want to thank everyone for attending tonight. Really appreciate it. And hopefully we'll see you next month when we're going to hear about wood ducks from Dr. John Eady. And Kelsey, thank you again, and just great fortune, continued fortune in your research and the projects that you're working on. So thank you very much. Good night, everyone.
Thank
Good night,
you.
Kelsey. Thank you so much.
Good to see everybody.
All right. I'm leaving, folks. 5, 2, 3, 1.